A soldier never leaves the battlefield even when the war zone shifts from deserts to sidewalks. Franklin Monroe wasn't the kind of man who liked to speak up. He didn't need to say much. He didn't need to prove anything, because the things he had done, missions that never made it to paper, nights with no moon and no way home, already spoke for themselves, until one young, arrogant, and deeply prejudiced police officer picked a fight with him in broad daylight, with bystanders watching, but too afraid to step in. What that officer didn't know was this. He had just laid hands on the most dangerous man in the room, a man who didn't need a weapon to make the whole world step back. Franklin Monroe didn't stand out. He never wanted to. A black man in his early 50s, wearing a worn-out gray hoodie, walked slowly down the southern sidewalk of Winston, North Carolina. One hand held a brown paper bag with lunch. The other gently kept his old cap in place, no brand, no logo. He looked like a retired mechanic or a shift worker heading home. But the thick calluses across his right knuckles were still there. His back was straight, his stride steady. And his eyes, those eyes didn't belong to an ordinary man. They were sharp as knives, deep as dry wells, and never lingered too long on anyone, unless it was necessary. The girl walking beside him, Amira. 19, wore simple clothes, a plain white tee, jeans, and a pair of headphones with just one side playing. She looked like a college student fresh from the library. But look closer, and you'd see her left hand clutching the strap of her backpack a little too tightly. They turned into a corner convenience store. Franklin calmly picked out a can of soda and a few granola bars. Amira wandered toward the candy aisle. Then the door swung open behind them. Officer Rick Danner stepped in, young, white, freshly pressed uniform, left hand cradling a coffee, right hand loose dangling near the Glock at his hip. His eyes scanned the store like he was choosing targets, not snacks. He spotted Amira first. "Don't recognize you. Got ID. Sweetheart?" Amira hesitated. "I'm just here to buy cookies." Franklin stepped forward. His voice was low and steady. "She's with me. Is there a problem?" Officer Rick raised a brow, looked Franklin up and down like he was sizing up used inventory. "Just routine. Lot of transients around lately. You live nearby." Franklin reached into his pocket, handed over his license. His other hand still held the paper bag. Rick took it, flipped it. Franklin Monroe, born 1973. He chuckled lightly. Name sounds like jazz. Franklin said nothing. Rick handed the license back, but before letting go, he asked, "You served?" Franklin nodded. "Navy." Rick glanced down at Franklin's hand. "SEAL." Franklin didn't answer, but something in his eyes made Rick take half a step back. Amira gently tugged at Franklin's sleeve. "Uncle, let's go. I'm okay." Rick squinted. "She, yours." Franklin answered slowly. "Foster niece." Rick smirked. Nowadays, everyone's got a foster niece. And that line was the first pin pulled from a long sleeping grenade. Franklin didn't snap, didn't raise his voice. He just looked at him, and that look made Rick's hand inch toward his holstered weapon. Rick Danner didn't take his eyes off Franklin. In the young officer's gaze was something bitter, not triggered by anything Franklin had done, but by his calmness. The way he stood there unblinking, steady, unafraid, made Rick feel small, even though he was the one in uniform. "You got a problem?" Rick asked, voice tight with suspicion, trying to keep it professional. Franklin answered simply, "No." Rick narrowed his eyes. "Then leave. I don't need some guy trailing a minor around this neighborhood." Amira froze beside him. "I'm not his daughter. But I'm also not someone you get to insult. Wrong move. A serious one. Rick stepped forward, pushing Franklin toward the snack aisle. I've got enough reason to detain both of you for ID verification. Franklin didn't budge. We're shopping. Not breaking the law, he said, voice low and firm. Rick scoffed. Yeah, I've heard that tone before. Baltimore, Chicago, usually right before some punk pulls a gun from behind his back. Franklin tilted his head. I'm not carrying a gun. I'm carrying patience. And I carry handcuffs. Rick snapped. The store grew quiet. A young boy lifted his phone to live stream. An elderly woman whispered to her husband by the dairy cooler. The tension thickened. Rick didn't like being watched, especially not when things were slipping out of his control. Suddenly, he turned to Amira. What are you doing here? What school got a student ID? Amira took a half step back. I don't have to stop. Rick grabbed her arm. Not hard enough to bruise, but not soft enough to be legal. Franklin moved. One pivot of his shoulder, and his hand clamped down on Rick's wrist in a single, fluid motion. No twisting, no strike, just pressure. A warning. Rick kicked. Not a warning kick. A full-force boot to Franklin's stomach. Franklin staggered back one step. No grunt. No counterattack. A police officer just assaulted an unarmed veteran. In broad daylight. Franklin's voice cut through the air, low and steady. I strongly suggest you call your supervisor, because from this moment on, every word you say can't be taken back. Rick was panting now. His hand went for his gun. Down on the ground. Now Franklin didn't move. The moment stretched, heavy, eternal. Amira lifted her phone. She had been recording since the second Rick grabbed her. Rick saw it. He didn't shoot. He didn't back down. He did something worse. He kicked again, this time, catching Franklin square in the shoulder. Gasps. A crack from the backroom door, and a soft, sickening pop as the joint dislocated. Franklin dropped to one knee, but his eyes remained open. His right hand empty. His breath steady like diving 60 feet beneath the Iraqi Sea. Amira stepped forward, tears running down her cheeks. Rick raised his gun toward her. Step back, or you're coming with him. His last mistake. Franklin said nothing. With one clean sweep of his leg, he executed a basic BJJ takedown. Fast, clean, absolute. Rick hit the floor. Franklin disarmed him, ejected the magazine, and slid the Glock across the floor toward the cashier, then stood, shoulder still dislocated, breathing slow. You just assaulted an unarmed man, he said, and threatened a young woman on camera. Rick lay there, dazed. Franklin looked him dead in the eye. Words can be defended, but a kick can't. Rick Danner lay flat against the tile floor. No one believed in that tiny badge on his chest anymore. Franklin said nothing else. He let go of Rick, picked up Amira's backpack, and guided her out of the store. His shoulder slumped, dislocated. Every step drained him, but he showed no pain, not one sound. Out by the car, Amira broke down. Tears mixed with fear, anger, guilt. But more than anything, weakness. And she hated that feeling. I'm sorry. If it weren't for me, Franklin cut her off, gently. No, this isn't your fault. You're the reason I got back up. The old Ford engine coughed to life on the third try. They drove out toward the suburbs where the city lights couldn't follow what they were leaving behind. But what Franklin didn't know was that Amira was hiding something. Not her age, not her name, but a part of her life she'd never told anyone, not even Franklin. Amira wasn't just a student. She had once been enrolled in a classified program created in the shadows after Operation Spectre shut down. A military cognition and response experiment, blending hand-to-hand reflex training with neural programming in adolescence. She was the only cadet to pass the reverse light reflex test, a test 96% of trained adults failed. But when funding was cut and files scrubbed for ethical concerns, Amira vanished from every record. And Franklin, he was the first and only one to bring her home, to give her a new name, a second chance. He never asked about her past. She never told. But tonight, the past came knocking. Back at the motel, Franklin sank into a chair, his shoulder swelling. Amira applied an ice pack but knew it wouldn't be enough. "You need a hospital." Franklin nodded faintly, then asked, voice hoarse, "When did you start recording?" Amira hesitated. "When he grabbed my wrist, I learned to react like that." Franklin looked at her longer than usual. "You were trained. Silence. That's not how a regular student reacts." Amira bit her lip. This time, her eyes didn't look away. "I was in Camp Sierra, age 14, Project 12 Theta." Franklin sat up straight. That name 12 Theta wasn't in public files. Only those with clearance from Spectre or Task Echo would know it. So, he exhaled. Amira nodded. "They trained us to hold breath underwater for 3 minutes, to identify weapons by the sound of a metal shift, to read the angle of a gun from the reflection of someone's shadow." Franklin closed his eyes. A different kind of pain surged, not in the shoulder, but from memory. And then they shut it down, wiped the logs, abandoned the kids. Amira nodded. "If I hadn't met you, I don't think I'd still be here." Franklin stared at her and slowly said, "You don't have to be strong to survive. You need a place where you're allowed to be weak without being hurt." Amira turned away, but her voice was steel. "I don't want to be weak. I want to prove I deserve to exist." "And today, if you hadn't stepped in, I would have broken my promise," Franklin asked. "What promise?" She looked straight at him. "To never use lethal techniques unless they use violence first." Franklin nodded. He understood better than anyone, for people like them. Once instinct takes over, it doesn't stop at a warning. That night, Franklin sent one message to one-man retired Navy officer Douglas Vane. The text had only 4 words: Spectre Unit. Reactivate less than 5 minutes later. A reply lit up. Monitoring Rick Danner case. Maybe time. Franklin set the phone down. He turned to Amira. "You ready to go back?" She didn't hesitate. "I never left." None of the bystanders at that convenience store knew that just hours later, Officer Rick Danner had been placed on temporary suspension. The local police chief called it a procedural step to ensure transparency, but Franklin knew better. It was just the system, buying time, covering tracks, and he understood one thing clearly. If he didn't act, Rick would come back. Stronger, better protected. And next time, it wouldn't stop at a kick. Franklin called Douglas Vane. Once the commander of the elite SEAL Team 9 Vane, now operated behind the scenes leading a restructured network known only as Spectre, an unofficial alliance of former operatives tasked with monitoring abuse of power within state and local law enforcement. They no longer wore uniforms, but they still had resources. They still had eyes, and they never forgot who was a friend and who was a threat. Rick Danner. Franklin said into the phone, "Do you have a file on him?" The sound of keys clacking filled the pause. A few seconds later, Vane replied, 3 prior complaints for excessive force during arrest, all black suspects. No charges filed. Complainants either lacked evidence or withdrew out of fear. Franklin's voice hardened. Footage audio. Vane paused. Then, yes, but never made it to court. Want me to send the archive? Send it to Amira, Franklin said. She'll know what to do. While Franklin quietly prepared for a legal battle, Amira had a different plan. She wasn't interested in waiting for the system to work. She wanted to expose Rick Danner for what he was, right in front of the public. And this time, no one would get to look away. 3 days later, a video hit social media like wildfire. Visual: Rick Danner, off duty, shoving a young black man into a wall, hand already on his cuffs. Audio: You people never learn. Do you? I don't need a reason to bring you in. Timestamp: 6 months earlier. Source: surveillance footage from a local diner omitted from the original case file. The video was cut and edited with precision. It ended with Rick kicking Franklin, then pointing a gun at Amira. Beneath it, a single caption: When the system stays silent, witnesses must speak. Spectre Archives. The Winston Police Department was thrown into chaos. Local news outlets demanded press conferences. The chief was under fire. And Rick vanished. For 3 days, no one could find him. His personal vehicle was gone. His phone disconnected. No activity on his bank account. Franklin knew what that meant. Rick wasn't in hiding. He was being protected not by the law, but by the very system that guards its own from the shadows. A system that survives only when people are too afraid to push back. But Franklin wasn't afraid. That evening, Amira traced a masked IP ping 1 originating from inside the Winston precinct, but not linked to official infrastructure. It was a private network used during internal training exercises. Inside a closed-door meeting with a hand-picked group of elite officers, Rick was speaking. That old bastard was military, I don't care. They think serving gives them a license to act like kings, and that girl, she looked at me like I was some criminal. Next time I see her, it won't be just a kick to the shoulder. Amira recorded every word and sent it to Vane. Franklin listened, then said, only one thing: I'll face him. But not on the sidewalk. In court. In front of justice. Courtroom 4 in Winston County was packed. Reporters clung to every word. The police department's legal team worked overtime to downplay the damage. They didn't call him Officer Rick Danner. They referred to him only as Mr. Danner, a man with a commendable service record. They didn't mention the kick, only a minimal physical intervention during a moment of chaos. Franklin stood at the center of the courtroom. His shoulder was still in a sling. His eyes held no anger, no demands, just a presence that silenced the room. The defense attorney asked, "You state you're a retired Navy SEAL since 2018. Yet, you physically engaged a police officer in the line of duty. Is that correct?" Franklin replied. Slowly, "I didn't attack anyone. I protected a young woman whose civil rights were being violated with bare hands. But you employed military-grade physical skills. That's a breach of force limitations under domestic security law. And him," Franklin turned toward Rick Danner, "he kicked me. Twice. Once in the chest. Once in the shoulder. I was unarmed. So let me ask, is that within the limits of official duty, Amira was called to the stand? She wore a white blouse and gray slacks, hair tied up not to impress, but to control her own breathing. Her posture was calm, intentional. The department's lawyer tried to spin it. You were once trained in an unofficial government tactical program. Doesn't that make you a threat to the officer? Amira didn't flinch. I never used violence. I lifted a phone after being physically grabbed. And in the footage this court is reviewing, it's plain who kicked and who stood still." She paused, her eyes locked onto Rick. "And if the gaze of a young woman is considered a threat, then maybe we need to redefine public safety." Then the courtroom went cold as the video played. Rick Danner kicking Franklin, grabbing Amira, drawing his weapon, and then the audio. Rick's voice, recorded during a private tactical training session. "That old guy was military. I don't care. They think wearing a uniform makes them untouchable. And that girl, she looked at me like I was a criminal. Next time, I'm not just kicking her shoulder. No one defended him after that. A juror lowered their head. Another clenched their jaw. Justice was beginning to take shape. Finally, Franklin took the stand. No notes. No whisper from legal counsel. Just the truth. I once breached a chemical plant under fire to save my team. I once pulled a girl from a car rigged for human trafficking, 30 seconds before it exploded on the Syrian border. And I once knelt, unarmed, in a convenience store while a man, not driven by law but by fear of my skin color, pointed a gun at a young woman. He paused, swept the room with his eyes. If justice doesn't begin with truth, then what is it? Is it the kick the gun? Or a badge used to trample someone's dignity? He turned toward Amira. I didn't teach that girl how to fight. I taught her how to stand still so others could see for themselves who truly deserved to be feared. When the jury returned, they took less than 90 minutes to reach a decision. Rick Danner guilty of excessive use of force, of armed intimidation, of falsifying his official report. The Winston Police Department ordered to release hidden case records from the last 10 years involving similar misconduct. 1 month later, Franklin testified before the state assembly proposing the creation of a statewide oversight commission led by veterans, legal scholars, and civil rights advocates. Amira was accepted into the Federal Institute of Behavioral Ethics and Justice, and Rick no badge, no shield, no defenders, only silence. The silence of words that couldn't be taken back, and a single kick that history would not forget.